Good. So I thought we would go ahead and do the week one lecture. I know it's kind of later in the week. I wanted to get this out a little sooner, but with the other four classes that I have going on, it was kind of chaotic the first week, getting emails, trying to grade some stuff already. Some of y'all have already submitted some assignments, which is really good. Kind of staying up with that stuff and not getting too far behind. But I thought we would go over primarily an overview of the particular reading for this week. I know there's some videos here that we kind of look at. What I will sort of suggest as it relates to some of the textbook reading from your e-text, which again you can find here. I realize that the MLA 9 handbook, for whatever reason, there's a broken link or something's wrong with the link. So I'm gonna have to figure out another way around that. But basically, for what you would sort of need for right now, is you can find all on this particular page. So I'm hoping, and we can kind of look at real quick maybe the MLA format, how you should start as it really relates to your essays and some of your writing critiques that you will have to do sort of on a weekly basis or every other week. I know this week what for whatever reason maybe I put in the wrong text box. It won't let you actually upload a file, and that's on me. So what like I suggested in the email that I sent out that shows you a sample A quality student writing critique from the past. If you sort of read through that, it shows you sort of the style that MLA 9 is, sort of what I'm looking for as it relates to the substance. Really, you want something to be about 250 words, give or take. I know some folks are just giving a couple sentences. That's not enough. You need to give me at least 250 words is going to give you, if you double space it, that type stuff, about half a page to a page. That's really what I'm looking for. Something concise, something to the point. Don't be taking me all in different directions. Just answer the actual question. Don't worry about the question. Sometimes when I give you these readings, there's going to be additional questions at the end of the reading. Unless I tell you on a lecture video or via email or a Teams meeting or something, don't worry about those extra questions. You're doing too much if you're doing that. So let's look at this video with the MLA format, and we will go from there. I also put up a video from earlier in the week, which is basically a general video introducing you to the course, where to find stuff, the syllabus, where to find your lessons. So if you haven't had a chance to watch that, you might want to go back through that. Um, so yeah, let's start here, and we will
Building your
go from
online
there.
business? Go to Wix.com and set up your store on a single.
Hi everyone,
Resist the ordinary and
You gotta
embrace the
love
wow
YouTube
at
because
Floor and
they have a
Decor.
thousand commercials.
If you're taking a trip with your friends, why pay for
I'll be showing you how to format your essay using MLA's ninth edition guidelines, which are the newest guidelines. So first, your essay needs to be in 1-inch margins all around. So Word and Google Docs automatically have 1-inch margins. If you want to just double check your margins, you can always go to layout. I am in the online version of Word here. If you click on margins, you'll see that normal is clicked on. So next, what you need to do is create your heading. So in the heading, you're going to have 4 components. The first component is your first and last name, and the next portion is your professor's name. So you can start it with doctor if that's what your professor prefers to be called by, or Ms. or Mr. Next, you're going to include your class name and section number, and finally the date. And you want to make sure that you write out the month. So we're going to, if you haven't already, put your essay in double space formatting. So you can just highlight what you have there, right click on it, click on paragraph options, and under line spacing, you're going to choose double. Okay, and then in the next line, we are going to add the title, and under text alignment, choose center, and this is going to be my awesome title. Notice that I am capitalizing the first letter of each word. I am also not changing the font by bolding it or italicizing it. It is the same font and font size as the rest of my essay. I'm going to press enter once just to get to the next line, and then I'm going to
Today we're
change the
going to look
alignment
at
back
the
to
historical.
left. And since this is the start of my introduction, I'm going to press the tab button once. Notice that as I type my essay, I am not pressing enter to get to the next line. It automatically does that on its own. If I want to start a new paragraph, I press the enter button once and tab, and you'll see that everything remains double spaced. Next, we're going to add a header. So in order to add a header, what you're going to do is click on Insert, Page Number, and choose the third option, which shows the page number on the right-hand side. And then just type in your last name and add a space. And you don't see it here in the Microsoft Word online version, but if you print preview, you should see it there. Okay, and let's say you have to add a works cited page. In order to do that, you're going to insert and click on page break. And what that does is it allows you to start something new on a new page. So we're going to type work cited if we are only citing one work. If it is multiple works, then you pluralize that. We're going to highlight this and center it. So I'm going to click on Home and Center Align. I'll press Enter once, and this is where I will then go back to Left Align and insert my sources. I've inserted a citation here, but it needs to be formatted. So first the font needs to match the rest of my essay. And I'm actually just going to highlight everything and change it to Times New Roman 12-point font, since that is what I always tell my students to use. Next, with this highlighted, I'm going to add a hanging indent. So highlight your citation, go to paragraph options, and under special where it says none, click on that and click on hanging. All right, and then the final thing we need to do is again right click under paragraph options. For line spacing, we're going to click on double. So everything in your essay, including the works cited page, needs to be double spaced. Now, if you want to do all of that in just a few seconds, what you can do is go to New and look for the MLA style paper. So it's already a template. Now, unfortunately, it says that it uses the MLA 7th edition, but a lot of it is pretty much the same. You can see here that it has your name, the instructor's name, the course name, the date, etc. And all you have to do is click and replace all of the containers. And that way you know that the formatting is correct. And the same with the header, you can just replace your last name here and it already has the page number inserted. So when you click on a paragraph, it will delete all of this for you, but you can see that it has already indented the paragraphs, and it shows you down here how to deal with tables and charts if you are going to include that in your paper. What I don't like about this template, and you should be wary of, is that it does not include a page break for the works cited. It also does not center works cited. So be aware that you can save some time by working with the template, but you do need to make those additional changes.
Okay, so hopefully that was really sort of a review, because you are in 1102. You should have uh, you should have known how to um, set up your essay from 1101, especially if you took 1101 from us, or pretty much any other college as well. They should have showed you the proper way how to set up um, MLA 9 style for your essays. So we will look at some of these elements of literature real quick. Again, if you watch the videos and you understand basically what's going on, and you don't need any further information about elements of literature, plot, theme, then you won't necessarily have to click on these. But well, let's click on them because I think these actually go to a little bit more detail than what the book has. Yeah, it tells you about the 5 elements of fiction that we're going to go over really throughout the next 3 or 4 weeks. So this is a really good handout because it does talk about plot, setting, character, point of view, and theme, all what makes a good novel, short story, episodic TV show, movie, this, drama. This is all stuff that you see pretty much if you watch TV or if you like watching movies. I mean, these elements are in those particular genres as well. So I would go through this and kind of look at some of this stuff again. If you've ever taken, and most of us have to take some sort of a literature course, 9th through 12th grade, you've already heard a good bit of these terms. It may be just dusting off the old cobweb in the brain to try to remember some of them, but you have heard these particular terms in the past, and we will be covering some of those as we go on throughout these next couple weeks. As it relates to any exam or exercises or questions or anything in here, you don't have to do all of that. That's really up to you whether you want to print it out and fill this stuff out. You don't have to. I would pay close attention to these diagrams because they will kind of help you maybe understand certain stories. But this is really, helpful knowledge as a review to get you back into thinking about the various literary elements and terms. And I believe, let me see what the theme will actually take you, and it's really kind of a short, you see, it's not that long. So again, I would look at this stuff online first, and if you still need some help, then I would go to your e-text, which is over here in the course e-text again, and look at these pages. So let's look at these couple of these videos, and then we'll move on to look at a biography of Kate Chopin and get a little bit more into her particular short essay. I'm going to leave this video because, again, it's a good summary. It is about 15 minutes long, but with my sort of lecture here, you can kind of use what I'm going to say with that, and that should give you a good, well-rounded aspect of the actual story if you haven't had a chance to read it. Like I said, some of y'all actually have read it and started working on this critique, which is really good. There are some, and I said this in an email already, but I just want to go ahead and mention it again. When I go on there to see who has done this particular assignment, who hasn't done it, and who's in the progress, there's a little blue circle that's halfway full, and that's basically telling me that something is in progress. So when I click on it, it shows that the student opened it up, might have started typing a little bit on something, may hopefully save what they typed, but they're not completely finished with the assignment. So it's showing pending. So you haven't completed it because you haven't saved it and you haven't submitted it. But the problem with that is once it gets closer to this Sunday deadline, at midnight, when it becomes Monday of next week, if it's showing pending, it's basically saying you didn't complete it. So whatever is not submitted, ready for grade, it's automatically going to grade it as a 0 starting on Monday. So make sure if you're one of those students, and there's a handful of them, if you didn't save and submit your work, go back and see if you can save it and submit it. Otherwise, I'm going to have to delete what you have, and you're going to have to start over because it's going to hold up the system for you. And it's just going to grade it as a 0 because there's nothing there really. The other thing is you have to complete this by the deadline this Sunday. The problem with that is the college is going to go through a purge, I think probably tomorrow. So if you owe money to the college, whether it's, a penny or $1,000, if you haven't settled that by tomorrow, they're going to drop you from all your courses. The other thing is if you get through that, but don't submit this first assignment, it doesn't matter if you logged in 13 times this week. If you don't complete this first assignment, which is really sort of a verification quiz as well, then I have to drop you Monday morning because you didn't complete any work. You just, logged in, looked at some of the stuff, but you didn't actually participate in the class by submitting something. So make sure, and this goes with your other online courses. If you're not completing that first week's assignment, they're going to drop you Monday if you get through the purge. So moving from that, some housekeeping stuff. Let's look at some of these other videos. This one's a little lengthier, but it's got some good information that you would want to learn and know about, especially review-wise.
With Mr. Taylor, part 1. This I'm going to divide into 2 different parts because it's kind of a long video. So let's get started. Elements of literature. These are the elements of a story, the different parts of every story. First, we're going to start off with setting. In our setting, we're going to need to answer 3 questions: where, when, and what background information. For where the story takes place, that's going to be your location. That could take place in a local mall, in your own home, out in outer space, or even in a castle, maybe if you're talking about a fairy tale setting. When the story takes place, a couple of important things to note. That will be like, is this in the modern times? Is this a long time ago in the time of dragons and princesses? Or is this in the future? Maybe if we're talking about an outer space setting. You also want to pay attention to what time of year a story takes place. That could give you important details. And the setting, as far as the time of year that something takes place, can tell you a lot about the story beyond that, oh, this just takes place in the winter. That might represent something more than what it is. We call that symbolism. We'll talk about that more later. And finally, with when, we'll talk about what time of day, because just like the season, that can also be important and give you some more details about a story. Background information. This could be anything else that will be helpful to know that we get out of our setting. So this might tell you, oh, this is taking place during the Civil Rights Movement, which could mean a lot for the different types of characters that you have. Or maybe this is taking place in a setting where magic is commonplace, where people are just used to seeing magic in an everyday setting. That will make a huge difference in a story, whether or not that's the case. Next, we'll talk about point of view. This is all about the narrator. Point of view is all about the narrator. First, we'll talk about what person it's in. Then we'll talk about the knowledge level of our narrator. And then finally, we'll talk about trustworthy versus unreliable narrators. As far as person, right now, I'm talking about myself in the first person. That means I'm going to use pronouns like I and me. The narrator, because they're talking about themselves, is going to play a part in the story, usually to be the main character, but they're going to be inside the story as one of the characters. Next, we'll talk about second person. In second person, you'll use words like you and your. That means you, as the reader, are actually going to be a character within the story. This one is the least common, but usually you'll see this in like a choose your own adventure novel. You are walking down the street. You see a scary house on the left. Do you want to keep walking or do you want to go inside? And it'll tell you what page to turn to. That would be second person. Next, we're going to talk about third person. This would be when you use words like he, she, and they. If you've heard of referring to yourself in the third person, that's when you start using your name and you don't say I, me. So as Mr. Taylor, I could say, Mr. Taylor walked across the room. Mr. Taylor picked up his Diet Coke. Mr. Taylor took a great big gulp. It would be really awkward if you saw me talking about myself in the third person, because that's usually referring to how the narrator and the reader are both on the outside of the story, and the characters within the story are the ones that we're focusing on, and we're talking about them like they're other people, because they are. Then for our knowledge level, we have 3 choices. We have objective, we have limited, and we have omniscient. An objective narrator doesn't know the thoughts, feelings, fears, or goals of any character. He treats those characters like they are objects, which is why object is part of objective. And it would be like me talking about my lamp on my desk, because it is something that I can describe as far as what it does, but I can't tell you what it's thinking or how it feels about life. I can only report what it does. The lamp is on, the lamp is off, the lamp falls off my desk and crashes on the floor. I can talk about it, but only as if it's an object. And an objective narrator will treat all of the characters just like they're objects and will only tell you what they're doing. Then we have limited. This would be when the narrator shows the thoughts, feelings, fears, and goals for only one character, sometimes a few characters, but very few. They're limited to only knowing about those certain characters. And for example, sometimes you're going to follow one major character through the story, and we will know what they're thinking and how they're feeling, but only that character. We won't know about everybody else. Which brings us to our next one, omniscient. Omni here means all, and then the science here means knowing. And we know that from the word science that we use a lot. So omniscient, we can say, means all knowing. This is when a narrator can show the thoughts, feelings, fears, and goals of all characters. And remember, omni means all. That'll be your big clue here. Our last question that we're going to answer about our narrator, is our narrator trustworthy? Or is he unreliable? If we have a trustworthy narrator, which is the most common kind of narrator, then we know that we can trust that narrator not to lie to us about the story or leave anything out. Typically, we're just going to go ahead and trust our narrator. Sometimes, though, we will have an unreliable narrator. It's not very common, but sometimes that narrator leaves out important information, or they lie to us, or sometimes they're hallucinating or they're a little bit insane, and we can't trust that what they're saying to us as they tell the story is what's actually going on in that story. It's not very common, but be on the lookout for it because sometimes that does come up. And then we're going to talk about mood and tone. Now, these are the two that are the easiest to confuse with each other. So think of a person giving a speech. The tone that they use in their voice will show how they feel about something. The mood is going to be the atmosphere in the room. If the tone is very angry, then sometimes the mood can be fearful because they're afraid of whoever is talking and yelling at them because that person is so mad. So think about it this way. Their tone is the way that they speak. So tone is the way that a narrator seems to feel about the story. And then the audience in the room feels a mood. The mood is the way that a typical reader would feel about the story. So they're both about feelings. That's why they're so closely related. But the mood is all about the reader. The tone is all about the narrator. And then the last one for this video, theme. I want you to say it like this. The theme is the universal message. The theme is the universal message. All stories are part of the bigger story of life. That's why we connect with stories. That's why we have favorite stories from our childhood, favorite movies that we really, really like. Typically, something about that story is going to speak to our lives. That's why we like telling stories. Stories is a big part of who we are. Stories are a big part of who we are. Sorry. And the theme is that connection there between what's happening in the story and what's happening in our lives. And a couple of different ways that you could start out your theme statement to say what this story says about life could be in life, sometimes people, or in life, sometimes, ... So in life, people sometimes will be more generous than you'd ever expect. So in life, sometimes things don't always go as you plan. These are the statements that it tells us about life. Now, sometimes the theme can be a lesson that you learn, and we have a word for that. We call that the moral. But do not say, when I ask you, hey, what's the theme, that it's the lesson or that it's the moral of the story, because it is not always a moral, but sometimes it is. Just know that. All right, that has been part 1 of our 2-part series on the elements of literature.
All right, we're going to look at part 2, the elements of literature. That's going to go a little bit more deeper real quick. So let me pull this up.
Of Literature Part 2 with Mr. Taylor. Make sure you check out the first part also because it's got some good information, but it's kind of a long video. So I went ahead and I divided this one into 2 different parts. Where we left off in the last video, we were talking about themes, so we will move on from there. Next, I want to talk about plotline. All stories have 5 plotline points. Now, sometimes in one story, you'll have a really, really short falling action and resolution. Sometimes in another story, those will be a lot longer, but you're always going to have that 5. Sometimes it may be, there might be a little bit more of a focus on some parts than in others. So here are 5 points. We'll start off with our introduction. We're going to call it the exposition. This is where we introduce the reader to the setting, the characters, and our introduction to our conflict. Usually our main conflict will get introduced here in the exposition. Sometimes if you talk about an action story, you might jump right in with our conflict from the very beginning. Sometimes with more of a romantic novel, you might have more focus on the characters and the setting before you really get into the conflict. It depends on the type of story. Sometimes it'll go one way, sometimes the other. But with that conflict, we're going to drive our way up to the rising action. This one is the largest part of a story. It can make up about 85% of the story, sometimes more, sometimes less. This is the part where conflicts are going to develop. You're always going to have more than one conflict, because if you just had one, that would be pretty boring. Here, you're going to have a few more, and this is where they really start to develop. Sometimes some of your smaller conflicts can get solved here just to keep us interested, but your main conflict that you have, that one is going to drive us up to our climax. So this is a smaller one. This is the turning point for the main conflict. Sometimes at this point you'll know how that main conflict is going to be solved. Sometimes right here, this is where that conflict actually gets solved. So this is also going to be the most exciting, and an author can do things like use really short sentences and use really vivid verbs to really let you know that this is the most exciting part. Usually this is the part where we don't want to stop reading. We're going to keep turning those pages, or if we're watching a movie, we are really hooked in and we will be upset if someone comes to interrupt us. We'll have our main conflict if we're talking about like Cinderella. She gets her glass slipper and it actually fits on her foot. That will be the climax for this one, because that's when our conflict that she is oppressed and she's trapped and she wants to get away to another life. It doesn't actually get solved there, but we can tell how it's going to be solved. We can tell at that point when that slipper fits her foot that everything is going to turn out okay with her life. And we can know that it's going to happen because the prince is going to take her out of the bad situation that she's in. But if we talk about Sleeping Beauty, her main conflict is that she's been put under a curse, and she has been cursed that she's always going to be asleep. Well, when her Prince Charming comes and kisses her to wake her up, that does solve her problem, and that would be the climax there, when she gets that true love's kiss. Her problem is solved there. So sometimes it's solved, sometimes you just know how it's going to be solved, but we're going to call it the turning point for the main conflict. That'll bring us down to our falling action. This is where things start to cool down. If there's still some conflicts going on, this is where those conflicts will start to get resolved, which is going to lead us to our very end, our resolution. This is where those loose ends will be tied up, questions will be answered, and if there's a lesson for us to learn as the readers or a lesson for a main character to learn, that's where we're going to learn that, or they're going to start applying that to their lives and change who they are. At this point in the resolution, we will know what's going to happen next for the characters. If we're talking a fairy tale, we can say, oh, and they lived happily ever after. Yeah, I know it's cheesy, but we'll know what's going to happen next for these characters. That's how we know that we have our resolution. So let's take a look at the plot line, zoomed out a little bit. Rising action there takes up the largest part of the story. Climax, resolution, those are usually the smallest points as far as how much of the story they actually take up. Then we'll move on to characters. Characters are the ones who are acting out the plot. We're going to follow them. We're going to talk about 3 different things when we describe our type of character. First, we have protagonist versus antagonist versus supporting. Our protagonist is sometimes the good guy, but not always. If we think of movies like Despicable Me or Megamind or Ocean's 11, sometimes that protagonist, that main character, is actually a bad guy. So don't tell me that the protagonist is a good guy, because that's not always true. Tell me that that protagonist is the main character, because that's exactly what we're talking about. Our antagonist then is going to be the one who goes against the main character, the one who causes problems for that main character. And then everyone else, this one's going to be easy once you figure out the first 2, everyone else will be a supporting character. Then, second, we'll talk about round versus flat. A round character will be a character that we know really well. A flat character, on the other hand, will be like a cardboard cutout. They're completely flat. We really don't know much about them as a character. We don't know their hopes, their dreams, their goals, their fears, things like that, because they're flat. A round character, though, we'll know a lot more about them. And then our third thing that we're going to talk about will be static versus dynamic. A static character will stay the same from the beginning of the story to the end. So usually you can't tell if a character is static or dynamic until you get to the end of the story. A dynamic character, on the other hand, will be one that changes. It'll be someone who grows up, becomes an adult, becomes an individual, or maybe someone who has to change something about themselves or about their personality. And that person will be a dynamic character once they make that big change. Okay, then we'll move on to conflict. Conflict here is what really drives a story. Without conflict, you don't have a story, because there's nothing interesting to tell. Every story's got to have conflict, and there are lots of different options for how that conflict can come up. Usually in most stories, you'll have lots of different kinds of conflict too. Our main two types, internal versus external. The only internal conflict is a person versus self conflict. That person has to make a decision. They have to learn something about themselves. They have to become a better person. It's going to be something that they battle out within themselves. Person versus person, that one's going to be the most common. That's what you think about when you think of conflict. You think of two people facing off against each other. In person versus nature, you might have someone trying to survive out in the wild where they're facing off against the elements, or maybe you have a person who's fighting against something natural, maybe an animal that they have to fight against. And then person versus society or group. This will be when that person is facing off against more than one person. It can be a small group, maybe that's keeping them down, causing them problems, or maybe they have to face off against the entire government or the entire world because they see a problem that they've got to fix in a bigger picture of the world. And then we can have supernatural, person versus supernatural. This is when someone is going to fight against something that has more power or a different kind of power that they have. So this could be like a person fighting against a ghost or a monster, something that would not occur just normally in nature. Finally, we have person versus destiny or fate. In this story, a person is going to know what their destiny is, or sometimes it'll be haunting them and they kind of get hints of what it is if they don't actually know what their story is going to end up as. And that character can either be fighting to get to that point, fighting to get to their destiny, to realize all the things that they've been living for, or that person might be trying to fight against it. Maybe they don't like where their destiny or their fate is leading them, and they're trying to fight against that for the whole story. Sometimes they're successful, and they can change your destiny or fate. Sometimes they actually end up exactly where that destiny or that fate was pulling them. Okay, and then we're going to wrap up here with irony. This one's not technically an element of literature because it's not something that every story necessarily needs to have in order to be a story like the other ones that we've talked about. But irony is something that an author can use to make their story better, make it more interesting, and drag us along. And irony in general means the opposite of what you expect. We're going to talk about three different types. First, we have verbal, then we have situational, finally, we have dramatic. In verbal irony, that means you're going to say the opposite of what you mean. If you do this in a mean way, we call that sarcasm. If you're being sarcastic, you know, someone raises their hand in class, they give an answer, and you know it's wrong, and you just want to say, oh, you're a real genius. That is verbal irony. You're saying the opposite of what you mean, and it's sarcasm because you're doing it in a mean way. If you do it in a joking way that's not mean, we call that being facetious. If you do it on accident, you don't actually mean to say the opposite of what you mean, then we call that a malapropism. All of those are just different types of verbal irony. There's lots of options there. Situational irony is what we usually think of when we think of irony. That's when the situation that you're in is the opposite of what you expected. It's the opposite of what you expect is what happens. And then finally, we have dramatic irony. That's when we know something as the reader or as the audience that the character does not know. And usually it's something that they really do need to know. They just don't know it. However, we do, and that's where we get the opposite aspect of irony. That actually is going to conclude our little video on elements of literature. Make sure you check out the first video because this one is actually part 2 in the
All right, so I hope that's a good refresher.
series, and I want to make sure you get everything that
For
you'll
some of
need
these
in there.
elements. Again, we're going to go back and come back to these at various times throughout the semester. A lot of this stuff will sort of come back into our poetry unit, which is going to be another 5 weeks. That comes after we wrap up the short story unit. And then we finish off our semester with the drama unit, and that's also going to deal with some of this stuff as well. Real quick, we're going to look at a brief bio of Kate Chopin, and then we're going to get into a little bit of the handout that I have here lecture-wise. So let me switch gears while we get this set up. And pretty much in the lecture there, I'm trying to keep these, you know, about an hour, a little less, depending on what we have to go over. But being that this is the first week and everybody seems to be in different locations as it relates to how well they can manipulate the blackboard, if they're first time students of online learning, first time students of college, that type deal, which most of y'all, I would say, you're probably not, because this is 1102. You had to have 1101 to get into 1102. So you probably had some experience maybe with Blackboard and online learning maybe a semester or so ago. So I'm hoping a lot of this stuff is kind of a refresher, but we will, move ahead. If you have any questions about anything, again, I can't read mine, so you're gonna have to reach out and, email me and ask me, right? So, because otherwise, I'm just going to expect and assume that since nobody's asking any questions and nobody's emailing, calling, coming to tutoring meetings or office hours, that everybody knows what they're doing. So let's go from there. Let's talk a little bit about the historical and the background overview of Kate Chopin here.
And biographical overview of the writer Kate Chopin. Catherine O'Flaherty was born in St. Louis, Missouri on February 8, 1850. Her mother came from an impoverished French Creole family, and because of hard times and the need for financial support, she married Catherine's father at age 16. She gave him legitimacy in the French Creole aristocracy. Now, St. Louis in the 1850s harbored the spirit of a fur trading town, and the city was growing as waves of settlers passed through to the west. Now, her father, an Irish merchant, furnished settlers with boats and supplies and provided his family a substantial living. In 1855, when she was 5 years of age, Chopin entered the St. Louis Academy at the Sacred Heart and was taught by Catholic nuns. The nuns at the convent provided her with an elite education for French intellectual women. Now, this was unusual given that most girls in the area didn't go to school at all. That same year, on All Saints' Day, her father was killed in a train accident. Thomas O'Flaherty joined city leaders in celebration of a new line of the Pacific Railroad, and just as the train crossed a bridge, the structure buckled, plunging into a river. Chopin's father and 29 others were killed. Therefore, Chopin was raised in a household run solely by women. She lived with her mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother, all of them widows, and they were smart and independent single women. Her great-grandmother, Madame Victoire Charleville, lived with them and taught her music and French. Now, Victoire's mother had been the first woman in St. Louis to obtain legal separation from her husband, after which she raised her children and ran a shipping business on the Mississippi. In 1861, the Civil War broke out in the United States, and one story goes that during the war, sympathies were for the South. Chopin apparently tore down an American flag and almost went to jail for her act. In 1863, her grandmother died on Christmas Day, as did her half-brother George from typhoid fever. He died on Mardi Gras Day. Some say these unhappy incidents combined to create a strong skepticism of religion in Chopin. Now, in 1868, Chopin graduated from Sacred Heart Academy at the top of her class. She won medals and was elected to the elite Children of Mary Society and delivered the commencement address. Then, from 1869 to 1870, she attended debutante parties. She learned to smoke and wrote her first story, Emancipation, a Life Fable, which was a short story about freedom and restriction. In 1870, at the age of 20, she married Oscar Chopin, the son of a wealthy cotton-growing family in Louisiana. He adored her and admired her independence and intelligence, giving her unheard-of freedom for women at the time. And they lived in New Orleans, where she had 5 boys and 2 girls. Now, Oscar was not an able businessman, and in 1879 his work with the Cotton Exchange was down because of the war. So they moved to his old home in a small Louisiana parish to run a general store and a smaller plantation. But in 1882, Oscar died of swamp fever, leaving her with heavy debt, so she took over running the store and plantation for over a year. But in 1884, Chopin sold up and moved back to St. Louis to live with her mother. Now, her mother died in the next year, leaving Chopin alone with her children again. So, to support herself and her young family, Chopin began to write. In the 1880s, writing was one of the few ways women could make a living, averaging $15 to $30 a story and perhaps a few $100s for a novel. There was great demand for short fiction, and one of the genres that was most popular was local color, which offered descriptions of various parts of the country. She wrote and sold numerous short stories about the people that she had known in Louisiana. Now, Kate Chopin sold her first novel in 1890 and followed this with stories, essays and sketches in literary magazines. Now, early in her career, she was already very successful. Her social world expanded and her home became a literary center. In 1899, she wrote The Awakening, one of her most famous works about a female protagonist, exploring what happens when a woman experiences her own sexual being and her own self. Unfortunately, the content and message caused an uproar, and Chopin was denied admission into the St. Louis Fine Art Club. She was deeply hurt by the reaction to her work. Now, the critical reviews and adverse reactions to The Awakening devastated Kate Chopin. For the remaining 5 years of her life, she retreated into private life and sank into obscurity. Now, she wrote 4 more short stories, but only one was published. On August 22, 1904, Chopin visited the World's Fair that had come to St. Louis. After returning home that night, she collapsed. 2 days later, she died. The official cause of death was a cerebral hemorrhage. Now, many of Chopin's works focus on the themes related on women's search for selfhood, self-discovery, or identity. Many also focus on women's revolt against conformity, often against gender conformity, or perhaps against social norms that would limit women's possibilities in life. And then other short stories might write about women's understanding of feminine sexuality, or of women's experience of motherhood, pregnancy, or childbirth. Lastly, Kate Chopin did not characterize herself as a feminist or as a suffragist. Nonetheless, she's a woman who took women seriously. She never doubted women's ability to be strong, and she embraced the ideas of spirit, character, and living life with the constraints that the world makes for you. Now, although Kate Chopin published her stories in the 1890s, her texts did not gain acceptance in the American literary canon until the late 20th century, corresponding with the rise of feminist criticism as a mode of the literary discourse. Thank you so much for stopping by to learn more about the American author Kate Chopin. If you'd like to learn more about The Awakening or something else that she's written, please leave a comment down below. Let me know what you'd like to read. And as always,
All right, I hope that was a good introduction about Kate Chopin. And hopefully it was a good introduction about the elements of literature. I know both those 2 videos were a little lengthy, but you kind of have to talk about that stuff to really get into where we're going the next 14 or 15 weeks. Again, you can kind of review that stuff. The videos will be up for a while. The videos are probably, those particular videos will be up for the next 5 weeks. And of course, you can always go back and read the information in your e-text if you need some more information about some of those elements. Let's look at, again, going back, I'm going to let you sort of go through the broad view of the week 1 if you want to go through that again, or if you haven't already. And also I'm going to let you sort of go through and look at this particular video, because our time, it is 45 minutes into the video, so I'm trying to keep this within the next 15 minutes for the hour. This is where you're going to find your writing critique. Again, if you click on it, it sort of gives you the instructions to try to have it in 250 words. Try to keep it in MLA format as much as you can. I know that when you hit continue, like I said, usually there is a way that you can add stuff, but here I guess they're not letting you do it for this particular Dropbox. You can try, the hyperlink really is not going to work too well. Sometimes it does, sometimes it don't. You do have the spell check. It's not the grammar. I mean, you can always start here and start typing if you want. Again, I would probably recommend, because you get to use spell check and grammar check, I would use Microsoft Word. Go ahead and type it up the best of your ability in the MLA format in Microsoft Word. Go through, proofread it, edit, spell check, grammar check, and then copy and paste the version you want me to read and grade back into here. And then hit save all answers, which there's only one in this case, and hit submit. So if you check your email, this is what I sent from a previous student. I just sort of changed up some of the newer stuff, mainly the date. This is what really the length of this particular, it's not quite 250, but it's close. I mean, it's 223 words. Um, they do integrate some quotations. Again, based on whoever you had for 1101, you should have did a research paper where you included secondary academic sources where you had to quote prose writing. And basically what we're doing here, we're doing prose compared to verse, which is more or less poetry and song and some in drama, depending on your drama. So I'm assuming everybody knows how to quote prose verse. I mean, I will give some information about how to do that a little bit more in detail, possibly next week when we start talking about our first major essay. But I'm hoping and assuming y'all took something away from that research experience from the 1101 course and really know how to introduce quotations via MLA. If not, you can always do a YouTube search. You can do a Google search. You can look in your book a little bit. It may have something. I will see if I can find something that will help with that MLA handbook. What I did here, because it's not going to let you sort of upload, I just did a footnote, which is sort of acting as my works cited page. This is where this person quote. Notice how the person has the last name and then the page number in this particular case. I don't think we have a page number since ours is online. So you'll just put the last name. But this is basically telling me where I'm getting the work from. I do have the header here, right? Your first and last name, my name, the course, and then the date. I know in the video it says you should spell out the month of, September. I've always written it like this when I was a student. Nobody gave me any hack for it, so you can do it as well. Make sure you have a proper title that sort of relates to the work to come. Don't just call it writing critique or essay one or paper one or response one. Give me something a little bit more catchy and creative. And make sure that you do have your last name and the page number on every page. Um, Going to the actual lecture notes. And again, if you already looked at some of that video that summarizes some of this stuff, this is probably going to be, again, another review because it's just basically breaking down this particular short story. So we're going to take a little bit of time, probably in the next 11 minutes, and just sort of go through this particular handout. And then we're going to end it and go from there and get ready for week 2. So, Story in the Hour is a short story by Kate Chopin, published in 1894. The story explores themes of freedom, marriage, societal expectations of women. Sort of a plot summary of the short story here, and it's really kind of short. The story begins with Miss Mallard learning of her husband's death in a train accident. Miss Mallard retreats to her room and experiences a sense of liberation and freedom. She reflects on her marriage and the societal expectations placed upon her as a wife. So remember, back in those days, she was basically a housewife. And really, they only had 2 functions. Serve as a housewife, the cook and clean type, and childbirth. They didn't really have the opportunity to go outside of the house to really get an education, meaning they couldn't go to college or anything like that. I mean, they could, but usually they didn't. And they usually didn't work outside the home. Um, Whatever the husband did, the husband was the breadwinner. The husband could come and give his wife an allowance depending on what she was doing in the house. But basically, whatever money he brought in was 100% his money unless he decided to share it. So unless she came from a rich family, the woman that is, chances are she didn't have a whole lot of money. And that's why divorce was really, divorce was sort of non-existent. You really kind of had to prove why you wanted to divorce your husband back in those days. I mean, you just really couldn't go up and say, hey, I want a divorce. They would go through, 1,000 questions about why do you want to go through a divorce? Because they looked really down on that type of thing. Um, and plus, too, at a certain age, you wanted to be married if you're a woman. I mean, if you were getting up in the, mid 20s, early 30s, they started looking at you, society as a whole started looking at you and said something must be wrong with this person because she should have already been married and probably had a couple of children, probably before she even turned 21, 22. So think of it that way. Different time period. Miss Mallard dies suddenly just as her husband returns home. So that's sort of the twist. He walks in and basically she drops dead of shock. We know she doesn't really grieve that much. She does a little bit. You can tell with her sister and all that there are really two conflicting characters there, Josephine and Miss Mallard. Josephine is sort of the old traditionalist. Miss Mallard is sort of looking for what they would call in Victoria literature, 19th century, about the time this thing was written. She's really looking for or wanting to answer that new woman question. There's got to be something out there besides what's in these four walls. There's got to be more than just being a housewife and a childbearer. Um, Key characters, the protagonist, Louise Millard or Miss Millard, she protagonist of the story. She experiences a sense of freedom and liberation after learning of her husband's death. So again, a lot of folks would say, well, that's kind of cruel and unusual, and why is she sort of happy to be free now that her husband is dead? But that, sort of that was the thing. She wasn't necessarily wanting to be, she wasn't trying to be mean about it. She was just trying to get out and see what else was out there for women. The problem with that is we don't really know, had her husband not come back in at the end, what would she do? She obviously doesn't have too many, we don't know really what her educational level is, what her skill set is. So by that time, there really wasn't too much that women could possibly do outside of getting married to somebody that was bringing an income. I mean, back during that time, you could be a prostitute, which wasn't necessarily the glamorous thing to do. It was the oldest profession of the world and still is. Um, she could go out and try to remarry, which really it doesn't seem like marriage was something she wanted to pursue after, originally thinking that her husband was dead. So there really wasn't a whole lot, too many options that she could really do because we don't know how she's going to get her money. We don't know anything about a will. We assume that the two didn't have any children. So that might have been a good thing. She didn't have children to sort of worry about and take care of. But her, even though she's thinking when she's looking out this window and seeing this, the sun and hearing the birds and seeing this, really this pretty picture in the far distance, hey, my life is going to change for the better. I don't really know, how better her life would be once she gets out from that house because we don't know where she's going to go. Is she going to live in the streets? Is she going to go back home and live with other family members? Does she have another house set up somewhere? Chances are that's not the case because she doesn't have any money coming in. So it's really kind of a bleak situation. I mean, she sort of gives herself false hope, and we see that at the end. We have Mr. Miller, who's Luis's husband, who dies in a train accident, supposedly. Josephine is Luis's sister, informs her of her husband's death. And then Richards is basically a family friend who also confirms Mr. Mallard's death. So we got to assume, I mean, he must have heard something differently as we get later in the story because her husband definitely comes back through the door. Some themes and symbolism. Freedom. The story explores the theme of freedom, particularly in the context of marriage and societal expectations of women. Marriage. The story critiques the institution of marriage and the oppressive forces that come with it. Again, we don't really know how their home life was as it relates to Louise and her husband. We don't know if he was abusive toward her. We don't know, what kind of how their daily interactions were. She did say at one point that she thought that she loved him at one time or did love him at one time, but now she's not really sure. So, I mean, I'm assuming they probably had what most modern married couples have today. They did have their squawks, they did have their fights, but at the end, they usually always sort of made up and, sort of fixed whatever situation was going on. But we don't know of any, physical, mental, sexual. We don't know any if they had any kind of abuse going on. We assume again, like I said, they don't really mention, or she doesn't mention any kids, so they're childless at this point. And that could have been, thinking deeper into it. Maybe that's a situation. Maybe the husband wanted children, and Luis, at for whatever reason, maybe she didn't want children at that time, or she can't have children, whatever the case may be. That could have put some strain on the marriage, like it does even today with some married couples. Nature is used as a symbol throughout the story, representing freedom, growth, and renewal. Again, when she looks outside the window, the open window, right? It's a clear day. I believe it's this, in the springtime. She can hear some of the birds. It The whole deal with the open window means it's an open area for her to sort of start exploring herself as this new woman. And we see this with the open window. The open window in Luisa's room symbolizes a newfound freedom and liberation, which it is. We have a couple quotations. This one actually is the one that we sort of have in our quiz or our writing critique, but you can kind of look at some of these as well if you want to try to use those. I already sort of put the in-text citation. The deal with this is just kind of remember that the period would go out here in this case. There was something coming to her and she was waiting for it fearfully. What was it? She did not know. It was too subtle, elusive to name it. It's basically freedom. She's been married, and again, we don't really know how long they've been married. We assume a couple years, but she's finally getting into the position where she's can enjoy herself as a single woman, something that she hasn't really experienced in a long time, and she's sort of been confined to the chains of marriage inside the house. Um, so that sort of coming in really rushed, really coming in fast at her. It's an emotional situation for her because she's having to deal a little bit with, assuming that her husband died, but she's also dealing with, okay, what's going to happen to me now? I'm free. I can go out and be who I want to be. I'm not chained down. I don't have to answer to another a man or a husband at this point. Um, so she's trying to work all that stuff up out in her mind as well. She wept at having rid herself of the grave clothing, but she knew that she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, the face that had never looked save with love upon her, fixed, gray, and dead. So she's sort of foreshadowing or looking forward, of an open casket, possibly funeral. Um, so she's kind of realizing, hey, I'm weeping now a little bit. I need to get out of these, depressing clothes. I need to put on something that's a little bit more vibrant, lively, more optimistic that changed my mood. But she realizes, she's going to have to go up and probably either identify the body to make sure it was her husband, or, when it comes to the funeral, if he's not so mangled up, and they're able to patch him back together and present him in a way, she's going to have to look at the casket again, especially if it's an open casket, to see, his face, to see the clothing, to see his hands, to see death. Basically, that's where we're getting at this fixed and gray and stuff. But we realize that that's not going to be. These discussion questions are just some things that you can kind of ask yourself as you're going through the reading. You don't necessarily have to answer them and submit those, but this could help you a little bit, maybe with that writing critique, because you can kind of use some of your thoughts and maybe your answers to put together a really good paragraph. Conclusion of the story is a powerful exploration of freedom, marriage, and societal expectations of women. Some women would think that they are still going through that process today, which they could be. I mean, a lot has changed for the positive for women, moving from Chopin's time in this story. And then there's still a lot of things that, some women would say could be better. The story critiques the oppressive forces that come with marriage and celebrates the liberation and freedom that can come with breaking free from those constraints. Now, you see married couples, they're quick to go to the divorce. a lot of times. It's not that big of a, hey, you can't divorce this person without giving us 30 different reasons why you have to divorce your husband or your wife. You can basically, say, hey, I want a divorce, go through the paperwork, get a lawyer, and depending on what all you're having to split up or fight, if you have kids and you got a lot of property and stuff, it sort of bogs down because everybody now is wanting to play that tug of war with stuff. But you don't have to worry about astigmatism. Why is she divorcing her husband? Because that's usually, if anybody was going to divorce back in Chopin's time, it was going to be the wife. Husbands usually stuck it out. If they didn't like their wife, they sort of had that cheating aspect to them. They would just go out and cheat and have a mistress or something of that nature, which, again, morally and ethically, that's not right. We still have, cheaters today in the world. That's just, I guess, part of human nature. It's again, if you're married, cheating on either side is definitely not something you should do because it does cause a lot of problems, and you will get caught eventually. Um, and it just usually doesn't end well for either side. Um, Through its vivid imagery, symbolism, and complex themes, The Story of an Hour remains a timeless and thought-provoking work of literature. Yes, it does. I mean, again, this thing was written what, 1894, and here we are. It's 2024, fixing to be 2025, and this thing is still being talked about um, for nearly 130 years later. It probably still would be talked about after everybody in this class, me including, is dead. Um, Probably for another 130, 230 years. It's just one of those classic short works of literature that looks at the evolution of the role of women, the role of liberation, the role of freedom, the role of marriage, from 130 years forward. And there's still challenges. There's still stuff that, could be better for some folks. Um, think about pay in the workforce and gender pay in the workforce. A lot of folks say that, if a man and a woman basically have the same degree and have the same amount of experience and working at a company for the same amount of time, is it fair for the man to get paid, let's say, $20 an hour and the woman gets paid $17 an hour? If you're that woman, you're probably going to be thinking, hey, they're really shortchanging me here. And should I go elsewhere to see if I can make more money? Because I think I'm worth at least the $20 an hour or whatever the case would be, like my male counterpart. And I want to feel that I am, you know, viable with that. That's why you see a lot of turnover sometimes in higher corporations when it comes to women, especially if they have that same sort of degree and a work experience, but they find out, hey, I'm not getting paid as much as Joe over there. So maybe I should go somewhere else where I can, make more money or make at least the same amount of Joe is, and, be better off for it. And then sometimes you got women that are sort of stuck in that position. They've been there 30 years and they realize if they do go off, it probably, even though they have the experience and stuff, they got a younger generation they have to attend to, and they may not get paid what they're getting paid from the old job to the new job. They may have to sort of prove themselves to the new company. And a lot of times, if you're older, if you're already in your 50s or 60s, you don't want to start a new career. I mean, by that time, you probably only have 20 or 30 years left. Um, so what's the point? All right. So I think that should clarify a good bit, I hope, of week one. Again, if you go back and look at some of these videos, if you need to go back and look at the broad view of week one, that will sort of explain a little bit more about where the syllabus is and all that stuff. But you can kind of find that over here. Simple syllabus, course textbook, lessons. But again, if you have any questions, concerns, issues, or whatever the case may be, you please email me. because otherwise, I'm just like I said, I'm assuming you know what you're doing and you're doing a good job. Don't freak out, panic, and email me after I grade something and say, well, I didn't really understand it. Well, you had what, X amount of days to get help. You didn't get help. You didn't come to any virtual or in-person office hours or tutoring sessions. Um, you're emailing me 2 days after I've already graded yours. So the time to email me would have been, 4 days before something was due because you probably already read it and knew that, hey, I'm going to have problems with this, but I'll just wait and, because I like to wait, procrastinate. And then I will, email him either 2 hours before it's due or I email him, a day after he grades it, which both are, kind of counterproductive. I mean, don't, freak out 2 hours before something is due when you had 6 days to do it. And, don't necessarily freak out after you get a grade. You don't like the grade, but again, you didn't try to get help. I'm here to help you. I want to help you. But I can't read minds. So you're going to have to take that initiative. All right. So I hope everybody has a great rest of your Thursday, a good first week. We will start week 2 after Sunday. Week 2 stuff, the modular, that will start opening up, I think, after midnight tonight. So if you want to get ahead or work ahead or look at some of the readings, because we're doing 2 short stories next week. They can be kind of lengthy if you wait to the last minute. So I wouldn't wait until, next Thursday to start reading both of them when you got a quiz or something that's due that Sunday. We will talk about the first essay that deals with the short stories that we're going to be reading. And then we may start talking about sort of the first exam. That will both the essay and the exam will be happening during week 5, which again, that's about 4 weeks away. You don't necessarily have to worry too much about it now, but I just want to sort of give you an overview of what's ahead. And pretty much, between now and week 4, you're probably going to have to do 2 short stories a week. And there's probably going to be some either quiz component or writing critique throughout the next 3 weeks as it relates to those as well. So I hope everybody has a great weekend. Stay safe. And again, email me if you need any help. Have a great one.